Hello, my name is Laura Clevenot, I come from France, and I'm going to present my research carried out as part of my PhD thesis, which is entitled Highway Stormwater Ponds and Amphibians in France, from Ecological Functions to Management Practices. In 2017, I came to ICOET to tell you about these ponds that were created to manage runoff from highway pavement and were being colonized by amphibians. At the time, I had just finished my literature review, which you can find in a publication in the Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution journal. This review questioned the role that highway ponds could play for amphibians and concluded that no one had yet studied the influence of maintenance practices or the place of these ponds in the ecological networks on their specific richness. So I asked two questions. Under what conditions can highway ponds provide a favorable breeding habitat for the amphibians that colonize them, particularly with regard to the maintenance practices applied? And to what extent do these ponds participate in ecological networks favorable to amphibians, particularly in the context of their dispersal movements? To answer those questions, it seems relevant to study the A77 highway, which is located south of Paris and crosses 3 departments. This highway has the advantage of having many ponds, crossing different types of landscapes, and having accessible data on pond maintenance practices applied since 2010. First, I implemented a protocol to evaluate the specific richness of the ponds. This protocol, called environmental DNA, was developed by the Spigen laboratory and consists of taking 20 water samples from each pond. This protocol detects animals that have passed through these ponds up to 15 days before the sampling and thus identify the number of species that have colonized these structures. I applied this protocol to 33 of the 56 ponds present on the highway, selected for the diversity of their structural, landscape, and management characteristics. Then, in order to know if the highway ponds were used by the amphibians either as real breeding sites or as simple refuges, I note that different markers of reproduction that could be observed, meaning the presence of eggs and larvae. Finally, in order to evaluate the influence of the technical management of the ponds on their specific richness, I evaluate the land use patterns around the highway ponds and compare them to the management practices applied since 2010, namely the number of cleaning operations, the date of the last cleaning operation, and the installation of anti-amphibians nets. A total of 12 species were recorded in those ponds, representing 67% of the species recorded in the region. Thus, up to 10 species can be found in one pond, with an average of 4 species per pond. A slight north-south gradient can be observed on the result map. This gradient could be explained in part by the presence of the Loire River and biodiversity reservoir near ponds with a high specific richness, although it's difficult to prove the cause and effect relationship. The results also show that the highway ponds are used by the amphibians as breeding sites because signs of successful reproduction have been recorded in many of them. We observed eggs at the beginning of the breeding period and larvae and juveniles undergoing metamorphosis in the middle and end of the period. Then, the statistical analysis shows no relationship between the specific richness recorded in the ponds and the factors of cleaning. This means that this factor has neither negative nor positive effects. This can be explained by the fact that on this highway, the ponds are cleaned less than once a year and often in late summer when water levels are at their lowest. This coincides with the end of the breeding season. There are therefore almost no individuals left in the ponds and consequently a low risk of direct mortality. Conversely, The analysis shows a positive correlation between amphibians' richness and the percentage of aquatic vegetation in the pond. This suggests that the presence of aquatic vegetation makes the pond more attractive to amphibians. Indeed, some species like to attach their eggs to the vegetation or to hide in it to protect themselves to predators. Finally, concerning the environmental variables, two results are opposed. When the landscape as a whole is studied through a landscape dominance, a negative correlation is observed between species richness and the presence of predominantly forested landscapes around the pond, and conversely, a positive correlation with predominantly agricultural landscapes. This suggests that highway ponds are used by amphibians in areas where wetlands are scarce, such as in areas of large-scale cultivation, but they prefer forest ponds to highway ponds when they have the opportunity. However, at a final scale, no correlation is found when using the area variable. This suggests that it's not so much the size or quantity of the surrounding environment that matters, but their arrangement. This is why I was interested in a second step in the place of highway ponds in ecological continuity networks, this time on a regional scale. So I raised the question, to what extent do these ponds participate in ecological networks favorable to amphibians, and how might this influence the species richness of these ponds? To do this, I went back to the land use map and using the scientific literature, I determined the degree of resistance that each type of environment can present for amphibians, meaning what cost of movement do this environment impose. I thus identify a declination of environments. Very favorable environments called habitat task, corresponding to the breeding site and in which I include the highway ponds, and less favorable environments, such as highways, which are completely impervious to the movement of the species. After that, I used the GraphApp software to model the least expensive path for amphibians to move from one habitat patch to another. This software allowed me to analyze cartographically and empirically the place of ponds within ecological continuity networks and to calculate different connectivity metrics associated with these particular habitat tasks. The spatial analysis shows that 15 of the 56 ponds of this highway are isolated from the ecological networks in their vicinity. They do not connect or are not connected to any other habitat patches. These ponds therefore play no role in ecological continuity. There are also ponds that can be described as marginal, 6 in total in this study. Most of them are connected to 1 or 2 habitat patches at most and correspond to the end of a path. For these ponds, it can be assumed that it represents a well or a dead end. However, within the so-called marginal ponds, some can play a non-negligible role within the ecological networks, a role that can be evaluated by assuming that the pond is made inaccessible to amphibians. Indeed, in the example given here, the pond is connected to only 2 habitat patches, which are themselves connected to several other patches. Yet, through these 2 connections, it provides an alternative path for amphibians, which, if made inaccessible, would have to travel twice as far to get from one patch to another. In fact, this pond reinforces the connectivity of this network. The last category of ponds that can be identified are connector ponds. These ponds correspond to a habitat task that connects one network to another. That can be like to elements of Japanese steppe corridors and thus play a very important role for the local population for which they allow circulation. The GraphApp software can also be used to calculate a number of connectivity metrics. I tested the statistical relationship between the number of tasks to which a pond was connected based on the DG metric and the number of species recorded in those ponds. The results show a negative correlation. This suggests that statistically, as the number of pools to which a pond is connected increases, the number of species recorded in that pond decreases. This result supports the hypothesis that highway ponds are used by amphibians as refuge sites. This hypothesis has also been developed by other French researchers interested in the relationship between amphibians and stormwater ponds. In conclusion, this study first of all demonstrated that highway ponds were indeed used by amphibians as breeding sites, and that the cleaning practices applied on these structures have no impact of this phenomenon. On the contrary, some of these practices can be beneficial. Allowing part of the pond to become vegetated can be seen as a measure to support the purification function of the pond, while offering a zone of tranquility to the amphibians that come to reproduce there. The study of the place of these structures in ecological networks also made it possible to demonstrate the role that highway ponds can play in the connectivity of these networks, as reinforcement of an existing network or even as connecting elements between two separate networks. These results support the idea that artificial environments, and more specifically infrastructure right-of-way, can provide different types of habitats and refuge for biodiversity, particularly in landscapes where natural habitats such as natural ponds are becoming increasingly rare. This highlights these ecological flows that exist between infrastructure right-of-way and the landscapes they cross. In view of these results, several research perspectives are possible. It would be relevant to look at the factors of acceptability of the ecological potential of artificial environments. What makes an environment, whatever it is, appear as a habitat for wildlife, for biodiversity managers, but also for all the actors of a territory and especially for the inhabitants? From an operational point of view, these ecological potentialities raise questions about the consideration given to artificial environments in impact studies and environmental compensation processes. For example, can highway ponds be considered as a double effect reduction measure, protection of aquatic environments and creation of a new habitat, or do they, on the contrary, increase the impacts of the infrastructure by creating either ecological traps or, as habitat, new collision ponds linked to seasonal migration? At the end, we could rethink the management practices of these structures by taking into account these new ecological functions. We could also rethink the location of these structures when creating a new infrastructure, taking into account both of the watershed for stormwater management, but also the location of local amphibian population and their hibernation sites. For my part, several publications of the subject are in progress, notably on the role of highway ponds for amphibians with the result of eDNA analysis, but also on the modeling of highway ponds in ecological networks. I'm also thinking of developing other research perspectives in partnership with SNCF Réseau, which manages the French National Railway Network. I'm currently interested in the issue of ecological transparency of railway infrastructure and in the enhancement of spontaneous biodiversity present on the edges of railway. Thanks for your attention.